Day by day, slowly but somehow inexorably, the Greensill scandal and satellite stories of cronyism, chamocracy, and outright corruption is growing, folding into itself and collapsing like a political black hole, sucking into it an ever-increasing number of players. It's fair to say the only reason we know about it is the dogged work of dedicated journalists in the Financial Times and the Times. It's also fair to say that the subject is complex and esoteric, and that has been another obstacle to the story getting even bigger. Nothing as simple and catchy as a duck house to be found here. To help us unravel the story's many folds, we have two of those brilliant news hounds with us today. From the Financial Times, Cynthia Merku and Andy Bounds. Welcome both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, let's start with a little bit of context. So, Andy, what is supply chain finance?
Yeah, supply chain finance is not particularly new. Any freelancer who's tried to get a payment out of a company will know you often have to wait a long time. And what businesses have done for a long time is some of them have taken the invoice and taken it to a financier who will say, I will pay you the money now, in return for which I will take a fee and I will go and collect it from the person who's paying you. Now, what supply chain finance did was turn that on its head. So the company tells its suppliers, you can take your invoice. Your invoice is going via someone like Greensill. They will pay you, and I will settle up with them later. And Greensill tends to get a cut. The innovation that Greensill brought to it as well was to package up a lot of these payments as bonds and sell them on to investors. And therefore, a bit like if you remember the mortgage securities in America, which started the 2008 financial crisis, the mortgage itself went wrong. And then the person on the hook for it wasn't the bank which gave the mortgage, but the investors that they'd sold it onto. And that's what started to happen with Greensill.
Why is the practice controversial, Cynthia?
Well, there's a lot of good reasons to use supply chain finance. I think the problem that is apparent more so now is the lack of transparency around it, but especially how it gets treated in the accounts of the companies. So it's quite a common tool now to use supply chain finance. But what happens is that if a company, for example, has a whole bunch of debt, it's not actually listed as debt in the accounts. So it can, for example, be treated as a trade payable or an accounts payable in a balance sheet, but it's not actually necessarily broken down from other invoices or other bills that it has to pay to other suppliers. So this is not actually broken out. So you don't know how much it owes to a supply chain financing company. It can be a lot of hidden debt because there's no requirement to disclose the details. And so accountancy firms and regulators have become aware of this and have, started thinking about ways to change that. The bottom line is that it masks, or it can mask the true financial state of a company. As you might remember, Carillion fell over back in 2018, and they'd used a lot of supply chain finance.
I understand there's a criminal complaint in Germany at the moment.
Yes, so this is against Greensill Bank, and that's underway now. There were concerns about the level of its exposure to Sanjeev Gupta's GFG Alliance. They have not said that there's any legal complaint against GFG Alliance, we have to make that clear. But the bank itself is under investigation, and a lot of the supply chain financing funding came via Greensill Bank in Germany.
And this is, I think, important because Cameron didn't get over-enthusiastic sort of lobbying to save the white rhinoceros. So it matters, doesn't it, that he was lobbying on behalf of a company whose practices are, is it fair to say, are a little bit controversial?
A little bit.
Yeah, I think it's true to say that a lot of politicians like these innovative companies which say we can do things better, quicker, sharper than the competition. We might be used to a politician going off and working for Barclays or Shell, after they retire. And whatever scandals those companies get caught up in, they are big listed businesses with long track records and very, quite transparent accounts that people pick up on quite quickly. I think what's happened now is you've got politicians getting involved with very recent privately held companies that are a little bit harder to track and obviously have a shorter track record, and therefore, things can go wrong in a spectacular way.
Okay, let's begin before the collapse and the scandal getting out, with what we're finding out now was really an extraordinary presence in Number 10, in David Cameron's Number 10, by Lex Greensill as a sort of quasi-advisor with his own office and his own business cards while also running this company. Cynthia, can you give us a summary of that?
Yeah. So one of the core people who helped Greensill pave the way into his connections into government was a very powerful civil servant called Jeremy Haywood. He passed away, sadly, a couple of years ago. But he was working with Greensill at Morgan Stanley before Greensill set up his eponymous company. And he was, one of the most powerful civil servants in Whitehall. And he kind of took Greensill under his wing. Also, in relation to Cameron working with Greensill, one of the things is Greensill is an amazing salesman. I mean, everybody we speak to is saying how persuasive he is and how much of a huge salesman he is. So I think people were also lulled in by him. He obviously came in and he had his business card, number 10 business card or the number 10 address. For me, the big thing as well is, we in early March, we wrote a big story about how Greensill's collapse was revealing the government ties. And I'd actually done a Freedom of Information request back last July, because what had stuck out for me is that Greensill had so many meetings in Cabinet Office, meetings every 6 months at least that were disclosed. And we don't know, obviously, whether there were others that did not get disclosed. But that was a very odd thing, because I didn't see their competitors having, what was dubbed, for example, regular catch-ups with senior civil servants. And I have still not got a response to that Freedom of Information Act request. Now, on the Treasury side, there was also a lot of meetings, and my request originally was also rejected. And it was only when Greensill started to, it became very clear that Greensill was not going to probably survive that, based on an internal review, they gave me the material that showed that Greensill had tried to get access to the CCFF, the Bank of England coronavirus, state-backed, loans. Underwriting.
Cynthia, why is Greensill collapsing? I mean, apart from, it sounds like quite a rickety business model, but was there a particular catalyst that caused it to cascade?
Greensill's, one of the major clients is Sanjeev Gupta's GFG Alliance. We're talking about billions and billions. And I don't know whether I would say necessarily his, the business model is rickety. The question is, who are your counterparties? How much due diligence is there done? How secure is that side of things? Now, with Greensill last year, that Greensill's insurance company was saying that it was going to not renew its insurance. Greensill was trying to find different insurance companies and failed to do so. In terms of a big insurer called Tokyo Marine, they actually did an internal investigation because they found that, or they allege that one of its employees had given out insurance that was to a higher level than that they would have normally felt comfortable to do. And so when that collapsed, or when that didn't get renewed, it had a snowball effect on also the Credit Suisse fund, which is where most of this debt, or a lot of this debt, was packaged into. And when they froze their funds, which was, there were $10 billion worth of funds, when that was frozen, that really sort of squeezed the tap for capital for Greensill.
So what do we know about Cameron's involvement since that time? So as Greensill started to experience difficulties and the pandemic obviously arrived, what do we know of his lobbying activities?
So we know that Cameron was involved, joining Greensill as an advisor after government, but he was quite open about his role with Greensill in government. I mean, you've probably all seen that clip of the video where he asked him to stand up, in a room in front of the cameras, touting him as a great saviour of sort of business, bringing business-friendly practices into government. He certainly wasn't ashamed of this relationship. What since happened was it's become rather tawdry in that, he's been trying to open doors for Greensill with other governments. We had a story recently that he'd lobbied the German government even after there were questions about Greensill's involvement in Germany. And of course, what really took it up another level was the pandemic and all these problems Greensill had with their insurance and so on, where they were desperate for more money, effectively, because they're having to pay out to these suppliers non-stop, and they need to get money in the other end, and therefore they were looking for government support. And that's where, obviously, you've got an ex-prime minister on the books, who better to use to ask for that government support, and he ended up texting the Chancellor on a couple of occasions, asking him if he could look again at allowing Greensill to access some of the pandemic finance support the government was setting up. He did get in meetings with senior civil servants, and since then, one thing after another, he got him a meeting with Matt Hancock, and since then, just one revelation after another has started tumbling out.
Yeah. And Cynthia, could there be more that we don't know about? Because the government has constantly used this line that, we gave you the texts, you saw the communications, there's nothing untowards going on. But it occurs to me that they've released what they wanted to release. Ultimately, there hasn't been any kind of wholesale, transparent disclosure, has there?
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, I think there's 7 or 8, I've lost count, inquiries that are going to be looking at both Greensill as well as the lobbying around the firm and the access the firm had, or the company had, in government. So absolutely, there will be more things that have not been revealed. My Freedom of Information Act requests have been rejected on the grounds that it would take too long to search, more than 3.5 days, or 24 hours to search 3 email inboxes about the contents of these meetings, which I have questions about. But I think what's really important also is that although Cabinet Office has been saying that, the transparency, part of the reason why we know a lot of this information is because transparency rules have done their job. I actually disagree with that. Yes, of course, in part, did we know that the meetings existed? To a certain extent, we did see some of it. We don't know the content of those meetings. What we also don't know, or didn't know through transparency rules, was the fact that, for example, David Cameron, Bill Crothers, and Mike Hancock met for private drinks. That's not in a transparency register, so therefore we couldn't know about this. And there could well be many, many other meetings or phone calls or texts or other ways of accessing government figures that we just don't know about because they're not being disclosed, or there is no reason for it to be disclosed. When you look at the Bill Crothers role, that again was not revealed because it was a transparency rule that revealed it. It was more the non-adherence of the transparency rule, i.e. finding the absence of something being there, is what revealed it.
It's almost as if the transparency rules actually left enough of a dark shape there to notice that there was stuff missing. Andy, has Cameron been cleared, as the government claimed, for a couple of weeks, although they've now stepped back from it?
Well, he's been cleared on a technicality. The lobbying rules state that, if you're an employee of a company, you're not lobbying. And he was an employee of Greensill, and therefore he was allowed to do what he was doing. I guess the implication is his role was known and recorded. Of course, the fact that he was doing the lobbying was not known. We knew he worked for Greensill, but without the doggy digging of Jim Pickard, my colleague, and others, we would never have found out about his lobbying. So it does suggest that there's a loophole, a rather large loophole there in the rules.
And the same goes for, now we're finding out, a couple of civil servants who were wearing 2 hats for a period, were working both for the government and for Greensill at the same time. Again, there's a sort of weird loop in the rules that means if you're already employed by a private firm when you leave government, you don't have to declare it to a COBA.
I found that absolutely astonishing, I must admit. I mean, I've been covering politics in one form or another in the EU and in the UK for 20 years, and it had
I
never
think
occurred to me.
I'm a former civil servant, and I think everyone I have spoken to has found that absolutely gobsmacking. I've not found one person who said, yeah, that happens. To round off the group of excuses that the government is using, as it were, they claim there's nothing to see because effectively their response to what Cameron was lobbying for was negative.
Well, that's not a good answer. I think transparency is so core, especially now where there's just trust in government has really been wounded for, through the pandemic and even before. So I think transparency and the extra probity of any government official or former government official of a stature like someone like Cameron or Bill Crothers would have been, you have to figure, it's not just the actual conflict of interest existing, but it's also the perception of it. But I think one point I just wanted to make about this Cabinet Office explanation that they have this conflict of interest policy, and that's how they figured out that Bill Crothers was allowed to work for Greensill, besides the fact that it's absolutely astonishing. Spotlight on Corruption, which is a transparency pressure group, did a FOI, a Freedom of Information request, a little while back. And Cabinet Office said they don't hold any of this information centrally. So it seems like they're allowing their various heads of units to make their own decision. I think that point I still find so astonishing because they are saying this particular policy exists, but yet Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, did not know anything about it.
Has no overview.
Yeah, has no overview and did not know, apparently, at least from his reaction, that other people potentially were also doing it. And as Crothers has said himself, he believed that it was not uncommon, which I think is mind-blowing.
Another story that sort of developed in parallel to this is the one with the New Cumbria deep coal mine, which has been approved, then not approved, then approved again, then recalled by central government. What's the source of that vacillation over the past year?
The simple answer to that is the COP26 climate summit in November. What happened was this coal mine has been a long time in the planning. Cumbria County Council, who have planning authority for it, gave it the go-ahead. There were various appeals, then it got the go-ahead again late last year. The government obviously has the right to call in applications and have a public inquiry. They declined to do so in January. The mine was all set to go ahead. And then a few weeks later, the government had a sudden change of heart and announced that it would actually call for a public inquiry. Now, what had changed in the between times? Huge pressure from environmental campaigners, from David Attenborough to Greta Thunberg, and not least John Kerry, the US envoy on climate change, and the fact that ministers will be sitting in November in Glasgow asking the world to cut their climate emissions, chairing the UN climate talks, COP26, at the same time as work was beginning on a new coal mine, the first one in the UK for more than 30 years. So the politics changed very quickly. I mean, what's surprising was they didn't call it to a halt earlier, or at least, call for a public inquiry earlier. And it comes down to the Tories wanting to keep these red wall seats. This is being built in Copeland, which is a Tory-held seat, and therefore local MPs, over 40 Tory MPs have backed it, and they are trying to put Labour on the back foot, saying, you climate, your sort of metropolitan green tree hugging is costing working class jobs in these constituencies. But of course, it's
oxygen loving lovies that we are. So now there's this network of inquiries, I can only call it. Do you think, Cynthia, is there a strategic reason for fragmenting the inquiry into loads of bits so that everyone has a pretty strict remit and no one basically goes fishing and finds things they weren't supposed to find?
I think a more broad point is that, I see this with regulatory agencies, especially when there's cross-border investigations going on, is that quite often people will just look at their little backyard and they won't actually holistically look at the situation. With Greensill, as we've said before, it's at its heart, it's a financial scandal. It's a very complicated financial story. You've got steel side of it and the politics of it. You've got the lobbying side of it. You've got the financial side, tying in Greensill with Credit Suisse. I mean, this is an international case. And in terms of the lobbying, they will look at their own particular backyard. And I guess the question is, will they do it in a way that actually really gets to the bottom of everything?
I get a sense in the last 10 days or so that the story is beginning to have a little bit of cut through more generally to the public. I've seen some focus group data that's saying that it's beginning to come up in this sort of narrative of chamocracy or corruption or cronyism or whatever you want to call it. Are you finding that it fits into that broad narrative? Does it feel like it's about to start hurting the government?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, Keir Starmer has talked about Tory sleaze, reviving memories of those of us who were around, with the 90s. Now, the 90s, I mean, it was backbenchers being paid to ask questions, which don't really do anything. I mean, here we're talking about former prime ministers lobbying civil servants to make decisions, which have huge impact. It's far, far more serious. And yet one wonders if the age we live in, people sort of slightly raise their eyebrows. I mean, I think Lord Pickles said, he'd raise his eyebrow a full quarter inch. I mean, he might have, in the old days, he might have been choking on his cornflakes at the very least. So I do think there's an interesting question for the British public of whether this is just that's what they do. I mean, I've done countless sort of interviews on the streets over the years, as many people have done. All politicians are the same, What do you expect? Does this fit into that narrative, or do people genuinely feel, this has gone too far and it's time for, some more regulation and some more values? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about a lot of this stuff is not in law. It's about morals and how people act and how they want
totally
to proceed.
agree. I totally agree.
Yeah, that's changed over the years, what politicians think they can get away with.
So what do you think needs, if you had a magic wand and you could reform 2 or 3 things about the way this happens, about, the transparency on lobbying and decision making, what would you do, Cynthia? What do you think are the most urgent things?
Well, slightly esoterically, but not. I think Freedom of Information Act is, as I've called it, wounded. Cabinet Office has one of the worst records in complying with Freedom of Information Act requests, quite often changing dates, not providing information on time. And I think there's a general reluctance to be transparent, not just in the Cabinet Office, but generally. It's interesting because Eric Pickles was saying, we don't necessarily have to go to thermonuclear options, but I think it's about holding people to standards that they might not have to be in some sort of rule, that because you can't capture every rule, or every potential option of something that could occur.
And when you do, you create a loophole, like we've discussed, the several loopholes. Every time you create a very tightly defined rule, that creates also a way to get around it.
I think it's a mindset. It's a mindset to think, what could this look like? Could this be interpreted the wrong way? Am I using a channel, as in the case of David Cameron, am I using a channel that is not available to everybody else who doesn't have Rishi Sunak's private phone number and has to go through his office to reach him? So it's about actually standing back. I think absolutely, I feel extremely strongly about the Freedom of Information Act, because there is no consequences pretty much no consequences on not complying with the law. And this is something that's very esoteric to most people. It doesn't capture the imagination like, a double hatting civil servant, but it is actually vital, because the Freedom of Information Act is not just it's not for journalists, it's for the people.
the element that's been missing from this discussion is that all the rules, if you look at the MP's code of conduct, if you look at the ministerial code, if you look at all the rules that are in place in most democratic countries around the world, when they talk about conflict of interest, they also talk in the same breath that you must avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. And I think that side of the British debate has atrophied slightly, because to me, the fact that Matt Hancock owns 15% of a company that's run by his sister, and that's now getting NHS contacts, it doesn't matter if it's actually clean, if you could look into his mind and see that it hasn't affected the decisions in any way. It's something that shouldn't happen because it looks bad. And when something looks bad, it's corrosive to public trust. That's the whole point of the rules.
But I think also there has to be a discussion about all this. I mean, the fact that David Cameron has a new job and he works for Greensill is one thing. Of course, if you leave public office and you're still, working age, you should be able to work. And I think it all comes down to the transparency of it. And again, this private eye test.
Just one final question, and I hope you can lay my mind to rest. I detect a sort of reticence on the part of other newspapers and other media organizations to pick this story up. They're sort of slowly doing it now, but it's like they've been dragged to it by the story becoming big enough. Is that true, or is it just in my head?
I just a couple of things on that. One, it's slightly journalistic envy, I think. I mean, whenever someone else gets a cracking front page scoop, you're always thinking like, "Whoa, is it really, cracked up to be? And why didn't we get it? Maybe there's something a bit wrong about it." So there's that sort of competition side of it. And I think also, as Cynthia said, although there is the lobbying aspect of this, also a complicated financial scandal, and a lot of papers probably don't necessarily have the people that can understand this. We're very fortunate, I mean. Cynthia and Michael Pooler and others and Rob have been working on this for years to understand it all. So the idea that you can catch up, with it even within a couple of weeks is quite tricky. I think also that we will get select committee inquiries. And I think that will be where the media pitches in, because that's all in the open. Politicians will hold other politicians and ex-civil servants and so on to account. I think there'll be a lot of reporting of those, and more revelations will come out, because select committees, to be fair to them, do tend to go in quite hard when they want to.
Just one point I also wanted to make in response to what you mentioned before. There's a point where this has been politicized. Obviously, the lobbying, there's a strong political dimension to it. But over the weekend, there was a suggestion in the Mail on Sunday that there were moles that were briefing journalists about the lobbying, which I can't speak for other journalists, but like at the FT, certainly that wasn't the case. We've worked mostly with public records in all of this. And I think this idea that this should all become politicized, I just find somewhat ridiculous, because again, it comes down to probity and transparency, which creates trust in government.
Thank you. Cynthia, Andy, our time has vanished all too quickly. Thank you for your time and for your brilliant work.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks very much.
Holding the government to account is arduous and sometimes risky work. There are always people who will seek to normalize corruption, to say they're all at it, it was ever thus, I've seen worse, move along. They say that about every single scandal that's ever happened until they don't, and people start paying attention. But there are also people like Cynthia and Andy and Jim Pickard, Sylvia Pfeiffer, Michael Pooler, Robert Smith, and many, many others who do the hard work. Along with condemning the former, we must also support the latter, and there is one easy way to do that. Log on to the FT and take out a subscription, or go out and buy their paper.